Welcome to the SmartTechCheck podcast, hosted by Mark Vina, your home for candid, insightful, and provocative conversations about the smart home automation, security, smartphones, PC and console gaming, and much more.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Vina, host of the SmartTechCheck podcast. Today is Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021. Election day in Virginia and where I'm from, this good old state of New Jersey, but we're not going to talk about politics. Well, we may get into a little politics when we talk about climate change in a few moments. But anyway, joining me for today's podcast is we're missing one of my trio of stalwart tech journalists, like the way I like to describe them. But we've got John Quain, who writes for the New York Times, Smart Cities, and Tom's Guide, and Stuart Walpin, who scribes for Twice and Laptop Magazine. And Rob Pecoraro is on vacation. No, he's not on vacation. I can't say he's on vacation. He'd like to be on vacation, but he's on an assignment in Europe, and spoke to him early in the week. He was excited to get on a long-distance trip wearing a mask, so that should be a lot of fun. He writes for USA Today, The Verge, and Wirecutter. But guys, welcome to the podcast. What else is new with you today before we begin? Come on.
I turned off the news. That's what's news.
It's still, we're getting a little bit more fall in Vermont. That's what's news. The leaves have hung on for just a few more days before winter comes.
Let me ask you a question, John. Do they run around in Vermont saying, autumn in Vermont? Is that the national song, the state song of?
No, they run around with chainsaws, getting ready for winter.
Well, I thought it was going to be actually a relatively boring week, a boring podcast, but actually a couple things have happened that I think deserve a little bit of discussion. So let me bring up our topics here. First one, got to chat about this one, and I cannot wait to start on this one. I just wrote a column on this in Forbes a few days ago, but Facebook rebrands itself as Meta, META, and what I thought was interesting, I don't know if you guys saw the story, but apparently there's a technology company that does have the rights to the name Meta, and apparently they're willing to sell the rights to the name to Facebook for only $20 million, which surprises me because that's relatively inexpensive. You would think they would have asked for more money than $20 million, but let me get Stuart's reaction first, because I can only imagine what you've got in the wheelhouse stirred up on this one, Stuart. But what do you think about?
Well, for a tech company only wanting $20 million, I mean, that just proves how not greedy our industry is.
Or stupid.
So egalitarian. So, well, obviously, this is what the path that Google took, when they renamed themselves Alphabet. And I don't think that anybody calls Google Alphabet except the people who work at Alphabet. So right. That's the first thing. The second thing is less what the name change itself, but what the name portends. And some of the video that Mr. Zuckerberg released showing the metaverse that he's thinking of was so devoid of humanity is to leave the whole concept of the future that he's plotting to be really frightening as far as I'm concerned. I mean, having followed virtual reality for a little bit and seeing the lack of real consumer uptake of it, one of the things that I think would be a killer app is something that he doesn't talk about, which is essentially virtual presence, being able to be places where otherwise you would not be able to be there, doing a little stuff with, attending NBA games and things like that. But him merely presenting the technological aspects of it as opposed to the real world functionality, I think is just going to make his non-human robotic creepiness facade even more so by dubbing the company something that portends something really spooky.
Well, I do agree with the comment you made that if you look at the videos they released, they're very aesthetically, they're very clean, stark. It's almost kind of it's a vision. It's almost like a Logan's Run, if you remember that movie.
I do.
View of what the future might be. And I wasn't terribly fond of the future that was portrayed in Logan's Run, but that's a completely different discussion. But I wonder, and John, this is a question for you. It was, if you read a lot of the press, I mean, as I mentioned in my Forbes piece, in many ways, the people who like to go after Facebook are, it's the company people love to hate. And God knows they've done enough things to inspire that kind of dislike for just some of the ham-fisted ways they've handled the various controversies they've kind of found themselves in the last few years. But you think this was done as a distraction in part, the rebranding piece? I mean, I want to talk about the substance, which is what Stuart is talking about, this whole movement toward the metaverse. But do you think part of this from a rebranding standpoint was a distraction to kind of walk away from their baggage associated with the Facebook brand?
I mean, some of it is, look, this is for such a big company. It was based on such trivial ideas, right? Like who's likable in college. That's the Facebook idea, right? That's basically it. And it hasn't really gone, terribly farther afield. And it's also the facial recognition story, which I'm sure you'll, they have this facial recognition technology like everybody else does. There wasn't anything particularly good about it. It had any guy with a ponytail, I ended up being tagged in photographs all the time. So it wasn't that effective, but they just decided that they were going to stop using it and basically delete that feature. They didn't promise not to use the feature in the future, but for the moment, they're going to do that. So getting away from that face, the sort of trivial nature of it is probably a good idea. But man, have all these guys read the same science fiction novel? Like this whole Snow Crash, metaverse, cyberpunk thing. It's like, we've tried this. That was Second Life. Hello, people aren't on Second Life. I don't see where this has really got a future.
Well, but let me just say something is that, if you look at Facebook and you look at the original design of Facebook, it really hasn't changed a whole lot.
Right.
It's very much a text-based. Yeah, they've not got images and video and they dressed it up, but it's still that same old interface that they've had for years, which is one of the reasons why it appeals to the older generation and older users, because it hasn't changed a whole lot. But the cynical part of me says, they're losing youthful users. When I say youthful users, very young users. Those are users that, their attention spans are, 15 seconds. They're the TikTok, Snapchat type of folks. And those users, I think, when they look at Facebook, it's, Facebook, that's like a Xerox machine in our generation. They see it as older technology. And now that's one side of the argument for me. The other side is that they've got to do something to keep people interested, and moving toward a metaverse type of environment. I think actually, believe it or not, makes sense from a strategic standpoint. What scares me is that some of the issues that have haunted them, the privacy stuff, content creation, suppression, and the list goes on and on. This facial recognition thing, which I thought was interesting that they announced that today. Several days after they made the rebranding announcement. Call me crazy, but I wonder, that's an interesting sequence of events. But I guess the question really is that when you look at it from a cynical standpoint, what makes us think that this bad behavior is not going to exist when they move to a metaverse type of orientation for the platform? I mean, go ahead, Stuart.
I mean, this is going to relate to the fourth topic that we have today. And I think all three topics relate to the fourth topic that we have today. But obviously, trust is the biggest issue. And I think the major problem with the name is its technical nature. I mentioned before that one of the quote unquote killer apps of VR would be virtual presence. And I think the mistake that Facebook is making here, and it's the same mistake that technology companies have been making for the last 150 years, is they're doing something because they can, not necessarily because they should. Right. And that's reflected in the name. The name that they have chosen is a pure technical name that has no humanity in it. It doesn't reflect what you can do with the technology or why consumers or human beings might want to use it. Instead, they're focusing on what can be done that nobody wants to do. As John said, Second Life. The uptake of Oculus and other VR is not that exciting. So I think that the approach they're taking, which is this very pure, look what we can do approach, is the exact opposite of the approach that they should be taking if they want to appear more human and more understanding of how people want to use technology.
John, what's your reaction to that? Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree too, but I also, you're right in terms of it is this kind of antediluvian old folks place online, and they've been struggling with that, and doing it via acquisitions in the past, trying to keep that younger audience, and that's the only way they've been able to do it. But it's hard to envision, if people are sick of Zoom now after almost closing on 2 years of it, I think they're going to be pretty sick of metaverse. That's probably not going to be a thing. Now, obviously, we've tried many attempts to make movies completely immersive and three-dimensional and all of that, and tried to make them virtual events. At the beginning of the pandemic, I don't know if you guys remember, but there were a number of press events that were virtual events with VR, and they shipped us all the glasses, and everybody, it was okay, but it was no substitute. And it's certainly the other thing to your point, Mark, is the speed, the rapidity with which people want to consume this kind of social media. They're not going to take the time to go into a virtual reality universe. I mean, that's why TikTok is so good, right? It happens and it's over. It happens and it's over.
Right.
So yeah, it's a strange move.
Yeah, we probably should do a topic in a future podcast just around AR and VR in general, because my viewpoint is that the reason why smartphones have become so incredibly successful is that, good or bad, because there's good and there's bad with that, with the phenomenon we find ourselves in, is that the smartphone has conditioned us. We're always within inches of our smartphone. People sleep with their smartphone. It's always attached to their body, and that's both good and bad. For AR and VR to be truly realized, you have to have some type of headgear device on, whether it's glasses, whether it's goggles like the Oculus stuff. And I just don't see that happening, regardless of the price. I mean, I think for certain applications, training, education, there's some medical applications, operations applications. I think that might be interesting, but I just don't know, because Facebook is so ubiquitous and it has such a big footprint, and all it requires, by the way, is a display or a smartphone, a tablet, or a PC, and you can participate in it and have a good experience. But I just don't know how this is going to get executed. I can only imagine the concepts that are bouncing around right now in Menlo Park. There's probably some really intriguing things about that. But let's get on to the next topic here, because I do want to get onto that, and that is, and this is a great topic. We've talked a little bit about this before, but this is your topic, Stuart. The major streaming services have kind of, when you think about it, they've emulated a television format that has been around for 50 or 60 years, and that is this whole notion of, in an episodic series, releasing an episode every week. Now, that's not always true on Netflix, of course. Not all their series, but many of their series, they'll dump the entire season. But let me tee this up for you, because obviously this is a topic that's close to your heart, and I want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, just personally, and I also just wrote a column on this. It hasn't posted yet, though, on the Digital Riff or Digital Tech Consulting commercial message. The problem that I have personally is that because of Netflix and because of Amazon Prime, I've gotten used to sitting up and for 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 hours and binging something. And so now I'm not watching any series that's on either a streaming service or a mainstream cable until I've got all the episodes. So I haven't seen any Succession yet. I haven't seen American Rust yet. I haven't seen Made yet, because I want to wait for all the episodes to be available so I can stream them all at one time. And the major point that I think that I wanted to make was that the streaming services are ignoring the one aspect that makes them different from both movies. Remember the old movie serials back in the 30s and 40s? Come back next week for the cliffhanger, as well as television, is that you don't have to make people wait. And the more people get used to getting all their episodes at once and streaming them all at once, they're going to start getting really pissed off at the people like Apple TV and Hulu who are making them wait once a week. The other aspect of this is that the streaming services, streaming TV allows content creators to create these really long, complicated storylines and plot lines and character development. And then the streaming services chop them up into little bits. Now, most of us, because there's so much good stuff on TV now, are being forced to keep track of a half a dozen different series at the same time, which is, of course, have given rise to a lot of the online recap things that you have now, so we can keep up with all of these. Instead of just, and the analogy I make is, imagine being in school and being assigned Moby Dick and Love in the Time of Cholera and Ulysses and Chernow's biography of Hamilton and The Great Gatsby, and being told that you have to read all of them at the same time, but only one chapter a week until we test them on it.
Right.
That's an absurdity. And yet that's exactly what the streaming television services are forcing us to do, to consume their content in these bits and pieces all at the same time.
No, and I want to jump in there for a second before I get John's view on this. I violently agree with that, because the creative content element of that advantage is magnificent. And what I mean by that, if you recall, there was a show years and years ago. It was one of the better medical series of all time, and it broke a lot of the rules. There was a show called St. Elsewhere during the early 80s. Very well written, very well acted. Denzel Washington came out of it. I encourage everybody. I think it's on Hulu, by the way. You can watch it in series. And what was great about it is that even though the episodes were every week, and the show was on for 5 or 6 seasons, there were times when they brought characters back from the first season that, unless you had watched the entire series before, they would do the flashback thing in the beginning of an episode to tie that old character back to the plot. If you didn't watch the entire series, you didn't get an appreciation for it. And to me, the magnificent thing about what the streaming service has done when you can watch all that content in a binge type of sequence, is you can go into levels of detail that you can never get into with a 2-hour movie. I mean, let's face it. Many movies that are based on books, the guy who writes the guy or woman who writes the screenplay has to make certain concessions, because it's impossible and many times to portray. That was Bonfire of the Vanities was true of. That was a wonderful book, but a lot of concessions were made when they wrote the screenplay. And if you had done Bonfire of the Vanities in a 8 or 9 episode type of format, you could get into levels of detail from a character development standpoint that you could never do in either a 2-hour movie or even over a season, because people wouldn't be able to retrieve all the older characters from earlier episodes. So I agree with you, Stuart. I think this is a magnificent advantage that the Hulus and Netflixes and the streaming services have. And for the life of me, I don't know why Apple does it. I mean, I started to watch it.
That baffles me. There's the company that's supposed to be thinking differently, and they're thinking the same. And they're not even tiny bits advantage of the fact that we're talking about an interactive format. They're telling linear stories in a legacy linear format, and it just baffles me that nobody's going out and trying to do something.
There has to be.
Okay, so they do have a reason.
Yes,
they do have, and it's a pretty significant reason for doing this, and that is engagement, right? Yeah. And they want that appointment viewing and engagement. So if you watch the viewing habits now of people who are following some of those series, they have to see it when it comes out on Tuesday night, because I was watching the Steve Martin, one with Martin Short and Only Murders in the Building, right? That you had to watch it Tuesday night, because if you don't watch it Tuesday night when it releases, all your friends are going to be chatting about it online, and all the social media is going to be full of it, and you're going to blow the whole season. So it forces those people to tune in to see each of them every week, which is exactly what they want, right? That's the perfect. And they also don't want the churn they've been getting. They want you to sign up for Apple TV and stay with Apple TV and not dump your subscription, a month later or a week later when you've done watching the only show that you actually wanted to bother watching on Apple TV. So they have some really, they look at the numbers, and this is a great idea for them to keep people engaged and keep them coming back and paying for the service. So, and that's given, like, I used to not write them, but I used to edit soap opera updates back in the day, which were all about telling you what happened on the soap opera because you couldn't keep track of those daily shows. So I get you in like being frustrated, like, what did they do last week? But still.
John, I'm shocked that you admitted that. I am shocked. Well, I could talk about this topic forever because it's such an interesting combination of technology and the creative angle, and of course, there's the business angle that you're speaking to,
right,
John. And I agree. I mean, they obviously want people to come back every week. They probably believe they can drive traffic. They can get people to watch other content that may not normally watch, but. I mean, but the Apple one absolutely confuses me because, I started to watch that Invasion. They have a new sci-fi series called Invasion, which I don't particularly like, by the way. I made it past the first 2 episodes. I'm like, this has been done better before. But nevertheless, I mean, if it was an entire dump of the entire season, I would probably force myself to watch 3 or 4 episodes and to give it a chance, Because I've just been disappointed with the first 2 episodes, I'm probably not going to watch episodes 3 or 4 or more. So that's the downside of that model. Let us hit the next topic here, and that is, and John, you brought this up. I think we want to talk about to the audience a little bit about what a compiler is, because that kind of shows you how old you are, that you actually use the word compiler. But for the audience, before you get into the security issues, let's talk about what a compiler does, and for those people who are not programmers. Go ahead, John. I'm always going to give that to you.
Oh, so yeah, I mean, basically all the programs today are written in C++ or Python or some other language that, actual programmer will use. But once you've done that and written the program in that, it's so much easier. Now you can move modules around and piece things together. Once you've done all that, though, it has to still get converted into binary code, the ones and zeros that the computer is actually going to run. And compilers are the step in the process where it recognizes C++ or it recognizes Python, and it compiles it into binary code really rapidly so that it can run on a computer. That turns out to be a major weak point, the sort of Achilles heel of a lot of systems. And that's what researchers have pointed out.
Now, John, the research work that you're referring to, is that saying that if there is bad code in the code, that will get compiled, and those algorithms, those nasty little gremlins that could potentially do harmful things, that actually will get embedded into the compiled code? Is that what the thought process is, John?
The thought process is you could hijack that program as it's being compiled, that the compilers don't have an extra step of security that they should have. Right. That's the issue.
That's very, very scary when you consider that the amount of code out there that 99% of the applications that people play with every day is all compiled code. That's pretty crazy. So
right.
Well, one of the most the biggest compiler weak points is everyday web browsing, because almost every web browser uses JavaScript. And JavaScript is essentially a real-time compiler, and it does a whole lot of things that you want to have happen to make your web pages look good, but it is a compiler that apparently something that can be hijacked by hiding malicious code in the original code that JavaScript will compile and put on your screen. And most browsers allow, in fact, I think all browsers allow you to turn JavaScript off if you go to the security settings in any browser. And I understand, I think for the last couple of days, there's been some news that Microsoft is trying to produce a JavaScript-less version of Edge, which will remove at least that one vulnerability in web browsers. Now, of course, the solutions are human eyes someplace to make sure that the code isn't being messed with, inverting characters or something. There's something about left to right and right to left in Arabic versus English, and I've been trying to read up on this for this, but apparently that there is, and the other point is that a VPN can help ward off some of the ill effects of JavaScript, but compilers are everywhere, and the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And a lot of people are poo-pooing that this is news. Apparently this has been around forever. That's why you have, malware called Trojan horses. This is exactly what a Trojan horse is. And Trojan horses that hijack original code have been around for as long as coding has been around.
John, before we move on to the next topic, do you think this issue has gotten the level of awareness? Because this is news to me.
It's interesting because the people, it's from the Cambridge University researchers, which is where that first coffee pot was ever online. If you were ever into the coffee pot, the first like webcam ever. Anyway, it's from those people, and it's an issue that people had hinted at before. I think what's new here is that they've shown how easy it is to do it. And it is getting a response from some companies. It is fixable. It's not something that's not fixable. It is fixable. Java, and the trouble with Flash and Java is that they're not fixable. To make them secure, in terms of programming, was just about impossible. It was just to keep things running. So that's why people have been dropping that left, right, and center and saying, eventually no more JavaScript because it was just used by hackers so much.
It was too unwieldy. Well, I hope the industry gets their hands around this because this potentially is a very, very big issue. But I'm glad that the industry is finally getting a bit of focus on this. Let's talk about the last topic that I want to tee up here, and this is topical because our illustrious President Biden, is over in Europe right now. I think he was in Glasgow this morning, talking about he was talking about partly about the Green New Deal, and not to get into the political argument on either side. And I was amazed to find that he only fell asleep once during the meeting. Can you imagine that?
Resting his eyes, Mark.
When he's at the podium, he's resting his eyes all the time, and that scares me as well. But anyway, without getting into a Joe Biden, kick fest, obviously, there's some interesting issues. There is an intersection here between technology and conservation and the ability to save the planet. But I want to get your perspective, Stuart, on it because you're a fair, balanced person, even though you do like the Nets. What's your take on it? In terms of I'm sure there's an altruistic point of view that you have, and there's probably also a cynical part.
Most of my point of view is cynical. I am a technology historian. I've written a great deal on the history of technology. And I always flash back, and this is going to sound a little off the wall, to the movie or the play Inherit the Wind.
Oh, wow.
And in Inherit the Wind, there's a scene where the Clarence Darrow character, which in the movie is played by Spencer Tracy, talking about how evolution should be taught in schools and that progress is not a bargain. And I'm paraphrasing. He says that basically he thinks there's somebody somewhere at a counter saying, yes, you may have the telephone, but you will lose the charm of distance. Sir, you may conquer the air, but the clouds will smell of gasoline and the birds will lose their wonder. And the point is that there's always a give and take with technology. And ever since the Industrial Revolution, we have been living with the consequences of 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. And where climate is concerned, it just looking at all of the varying solutions other than wind and maybe to a lesser extent solar, and maybe even solar, the amount of energy it takes to produce these renewable things seem to be almost as much energy or carbon producing as what they're replacing. And so it's very difficult to figure out how to solve this problem if you're creating more problems while you're doing it. I don't know what the answer is. And as somebody who's been writing about technology, one would hope to be optimistic that this is merely technology and that the problems can be solved. But for instance, the mining of lithium is getting to be a problem. It's not exactly plentiful. And a lot of places where it's available, you have to ruin ecological areas, so I mean, almost every solution we seem to have to replace fossil fuels seems to introduce another ecological problem.
Well, and the point you're making, of course, it goes very much to electric cars. Electric cars use enormous batteries.
Yes.
These are not batteries that are used. And by the way, there's also geopolitical issues in that most of the battery material that is used to manufacture these batteries doesn't come from the United States. It's outside the United States. So there's obviously there's
geopolitical issues.
Yes, I'll say it that way. John, your thoughts on this? John?
Well, I mean, yes, yeah. So electric cars are still more efficient on every study, and every breakdown and every which way you look at it, way more than gas combustion engines vehicles. And to wind and solar too, they are solutions. They don't actually eat more resources. Mining is definitely an issue because if you're worried about the environment, there's a lot of strip mining and things that go on to produce these. But it's about, we should be doing something about it, and I think there are solutions out there that do work toward it. And it's amazingly actually how quickly you can turn a company around and make it like a zero footprint company. If Suntory can do it in a few months, I think, and Subaru can do it. Not too difficult for other people to do it as well. And what I realized about Bitcoin, though, was, this mining for Bitcoin is eating up a tremendous amount of electricity, for what? It was supposed to be this great idea, and all it's doing is hurting sustainability rather than helping anything. So I think that's one of the oddest sort of weird ramifications of things like that. Whereas, do we really need to data mine like for Bitcoin? Probably not. So, and companies got to think about remote work. Now we've been doing this for a long time. Do we really need everybody back driving to work? I mean, traffic in New York is horrendous. It's worse than it was before the pandemic. So maybe we don't need that.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah. It is. It is because people don't want to take public transportation, so they're driving into the city. So, I have to go back and forth a couple of times a week. It's a nightmare. The only time you can actually get into New York City is like if you drive in the middle of the night. Every other time is terrible. So, yeah, we've got some work cut out for us here.
And I'll just comment on that one thing. When I was back in New Jersey, probably about 2 months ago, I went to see a Yankee game, and I was in Jersey at my family's home. And I think the George Washington Bridge is now, isn't it $14 or some crazy? What's the fare?
It was 18.
Is it 18?
It's more than that, yeah.
I remember when a round trip, and it was round trip because you only pay one way, and it's free on the way back. Right. Free. You only pay one time. It was like $2 or $3. I don't know how you make that math work if you tried to commute to New York every day. $100 in tolls? I mean, a week? That's crazy. But,
well, a couple of weekends ago, my wife and I took our first walk across the George Washington Bridge, so that's certainly one way of avoiding the fare.
I'm surprised the Glasgow didn't try to hit you up for a few bucks just to walk across the bridge. Before we end the podcast, I do want to get, it's kind of orthogonal to this, but I don't know if you guys saw it this morning, but there was Hertz announced that I think they were going to buy 50,000 or 100,000 electric cars from Tesla.
100,000, yeah.
100,000. And then Elon Musk this morning announced, we really haven't signed the paperwork.
Where's the money?
Well, because Hertz is in a little bit of trouble. But here's the thing. This has happened before with Tesla, where Musk will say something. You would think the SEC would have an opinion on this because that affects stock prices. When a company makes an announcement like that, that's a material announcement. 100,000 cars, And then he made the point this morning. I guess well, if we sell them the cars, it's not going to affect our margins. We're going to sell them at the standard price that we typically sell, which I'm sure Hertz loves that, because you would think they'd want a deal if they were going to buy 100,000 cars. But Stuart, how does Elon Musk get away with that? I mean, it's bizarre to me that something like that could get announced in such a kind of a disconnected way.
I don't know why this is a surprise. You've never heard of John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carter? I mean, this sort of manipulation of stocks is why the SEC was created to begin with. And that didn't happen until 50 years after Rockefeller founded Standard Oil. So, I mean, the idea that these titans try to manipulate stock as much as they can, given the legal restrictions, it is not fake news. It's just really, really old news. I love the story. I don't know, love is the right word. You'll excuse that expression. But when they broke up Standard Oil in 1911, John D. Rockefeller was over the moon, because instead of owning one company, he now owned 11 or 12 or whatever the number of baby subs that there were. And each one of them had their own stock prices. So the fact that these robber barons manipulate the news to help their stock prices is really.
I'm just, I've worked for companies, very, very big, successful companies, where this kind of behavior would never happen. It just wouldn't.
Right.
They're much
well,
more.
and we are in a new age of robber barons. I think ever since as the income equality has division has widened, you have a lot more. What is it now? I think there are 700 billionaires. I think that was part of the bill, the reconciliation package that Biden was talking about, that they want to do a billionaires tax, and that it would only affect 700 people. There used to be maybe 700 millionaires in the country. Now there's 700 billionaires. So, I mean, we are in this age of robber barons. They all made a lot more money during the pandemic. This is we're in a new robber baron age. And again, as the legal system is ought to do, just can't keep up with it.
Well, one of that 700 is John Quain, because he,
yeah,
and,
I wish.
I'm always appreciative, John, when you take the time to do my podcast. That's really
right.
Good of you.
Right. I mean, Elon is definitely an outlier. I mean, there's no question he's an outlier. That whole comment too about, oh yeah, you want $6 billion to solve world hunger? I'll give you $6 billion. How stoned was he when he said that? I don't know, but this issue with Hertz too. Hertz is now run by one of these, a guy I like. I've liked his management style. Mark, he's from Ford. He ran Ford before. And so he got turfed out of Ford because, they didn't like his vision. So now he's at Hertz. I think they will turn it around. I don't know what the deal is and the pricing. That's going to be questionable.
Yeah, I don't know really where this ends, but it just seems every time there's a miscommunication, and I'm putting that in air quotes, you can see that on the camera. It just seems odd to me that and then you don't see the SEC acting, that, oh, by the way, there should be something, because the SEC does have penalties in place where companies can get penalized. Now the problem is that Tesla is so big that unless the penalty is enormous,
right. Pay the $2.
Pay the $2 and it goes away. Exactly. But guys, listen, thank you for doing today's podcast. I do really appreciate it. John and Stuart, for our viewing and listening audience, please make sure that you hit the like and subscribe buttons at the end of today's podcast. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Mark Vina Tech Guy. And until next time, have a great weekend.